Welcome back to Math 103. This is video number 11 on measuring power. We've been discussing one approach to measuring power, measuring the actual power exercised by each player in a weighted voting system, and that approach has been the approach of Banzhaf, based on winning coalitions and critical players in winning coalitions. There's another approach we're going to turn to now, the Shapley-Shubik power distribution. This is another approach, and it answers the same question. How is the actual power distributed among the players? The approach that Shapley and Shubik take still needs the notion of a winning coalition, but their approach is based on a different notion of how winning coalitions are formed. Before we get into this, it's worth noting that Lloyd Shapley won the 2012 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on cooperative game theory, to which the topic of measuring power in weighted voting systems is related. That makes two Nobel Prize winners now in economics for work that is essentially mathematical, whom we've discussed in this course, Arrow in the last chapter on voting, and now Shapley in the context of measuring power. Just as there was a certain narrative that helped us understand Banzhaf's approach, now consider the Shapley-Shubik narrative. So we think of coalitions as being formed one player at a time. So Banzhaf's conception was implicitly based on the idea that everyone already knows which way they're going to vote. Everyone simultaneously is either a yes voter or a no voter, and then we can focus on one player and think about what would happen if they changed their mind. Now we're going to think of coalitions as starting from scratch, built up one player at a time. So what does that mean? Suppose that there are four members of a legislative committee. Let's call them A, B, C, and D. Why not? We haven't used those letters yet in this course. So first, C gets the idea to introduce legislation. Okay, some proposal, and at the moment, C is the only supporter of this law. So C is the only yes voter. Everyone else is still a no voter. Then C persuades B to join in, to support the cause. Right? As of now, the coalition of yes voters, the voters in favor of supporting the legislation, the members of the committee voting yes, consists of C and B. Next, D decides to join in. So C and B are yes voters, and they persuade D to join in, and now C, B, and D are the collection of yes voters. And finally, A joins in and says, okay, I'll vote with the rest of you. And as of N, you've got everybody, C, B, D, and A, all of them, voting yes. We use new notation to describe the scenario where C starts out voting yes, then B joins in, then D joins in, then A, in exactly that order. We use these angle brackets here instead of the curly braces of winning coalitions. So this notation here is what we call a sequential coalition. Every sequential coalition is going to contain all the players written out in one specific order, right? And it will indicate the order in which the players gradually, one by one, say, yes, I will vote for this piece of legislation. I will vote to pass this motion. Right? So by writing down this notation, another way to think of it is that this is inviting us to think about four coalitions, not all of them winning coalitions necessarily, but four coalitions in succession. First, the coalition of just C, then the coalition of C together with B, then the coalition C, then and B and D all together, and finally the grand coalition. Somewhere along the way, in this process of building up from one supporter to unanimous supports, somewhere along the way, we went from not having enough support to pass the law to having enough support. Somewhere along the way, a winning coalition appeared on this list for the first time. Right? So maybe C is a dictator. Maybe C by himself, herself, is already a winning coalition. Or maybe C is not a dictator, but the act of B joining in produces a winning coalition. Or maybe C and B can't pass the legislation by themselves, but when D joins in, then they have enough. Or maybe C, B, and D can't get the job done, and only when A shows up is a winning coalition formed. So once we've written down this sequence, which is prompted by writing down the players in that particular sequence, and once we've written down this sequence of coalitions, we can ask, which one is the first winning coalition on the list? Okay. At what stage in this gradual process of building up support were there enough Was there enough support to actually pass the law? In that first winning coalition on the list, whichever coalition is the first one to be a winning one, we'll do a concrete example in a minute, but whichever coalition here turns out to be the first winning one on the list, we can ask, who is the player who just joined who turned it into a winning coalition? So for example, suppose that C and B can't pass the legislation, they don't have enough votes between the two of them. But when D joins in, now that's a winning coalition. Aha! Then in a certain sense, D plays a pivotal role in this scenario in getting the law passed. D is the one whose arrival makes all the difference. And once D has arrived, I mean, if this really is a winning coalition, CBD, then A's arrival at the end is just dressing on the cake. That's not really changing the outcome. Okay. So from the Shapley-Shubik point of view, whoever that player is who just joined and as a result first helped achieve a winning coalition, whoever that player is, that's the one who is exercising the actual power in this scenario. We call that player the pivotal player. Okay? So a way to phrase that is, if there is not enough support for a law until a certain player arrives and votes yes, then that's the player whose vote makes all the difference. Let's look at a concrete example. Consider the weighted voting system with quota 10 and weights 7, 5, 3, and 2. Let's call A, B, C, and D the players who have weights 7, 5, 3, and 2 respectively. Consider the sequential coalition we've been talking about, CBDA, in exactly that order, and therefore the associated sequence of coalitions, C alone, C together with B, C, B, and D together, and C, B, D, and A together. Notice that in order to determine whether a certain coalition is a winning coalition, that's just a matter of counting up the total weight of that coalition. So for purposes of determining whether a coalition has enough votes to make the quota, the order doesn't matter there. The place where the order matters is determining how we write out this sequence of coalitions here. Now, before going on to the next video, answer the following two questions. Of these four coalitions, of these four, which is the first winning coalition on the list, and who is the pivotal player? In other words, whichever coalition is the first winning coalition on this list, who is the new player, the one who just joined? That's the player who, according to Shapley and Shubik, is exercising the real power in this scenario.